Hey, it's Corey here at Fuel Your Photos, and today we're going to be talking about image file size. And the key thing here is to realize that your images need to be an appropriate size for the space that you're going to be using them on the internet. So today we'll talk about two different types of places that you may use your image, and one will be a full screen image that takes up the entire browser window, and the other will be a blog post image that just fits in a normal blog post. So when we talk about a full screen image, it is important to realize that often the aspect ratio is more important than the actual pixel dimensions. So in this case, my screen is 1920 pixels wide, but if I just resize the image to be 1920 pixels wide, it will be 1280 pixels high, and that doesn't match the aspect ratio of my screen. And so what you see here is an image that has just been resized for the appropriate width, and you can see that it gets cut off here. I'll actually show you the original image here in Photoshop. But if I want to control that, I can do so by cropping to a appropriate aspect ratio. And so here's an example where I went ahead and cropped this image, and I used the dimension 1920 by 980. And if you want to know even more about this process and the appropriate aspect ratio, I recommend this article by Flow Themes, where they go into all of the details on cropping and aspect ratio for full screen images for the web. But for now, let's just go ahead and use these dimensions, 1920 by 980, for full screen images. So let's look at how you might crop your images to 1920 by 980 pixels. So first of all, we'll do this crop in Photoshop. This one is pretty easy. All you need to do is select the crop tool, and up here you'll have a place where you can type in the exact dimension. So you just want to type in 1920 px, which stands for pixels, by 980 px. And then whenever you use the crop tool, it will be constrained to those proportions, and you can drag it however you want to make sure that you achieve the crop that you're looking for. Whenever you're done with that, you just press enter to crop it, and you'll be able to save from there. We'll talk about saving in a few minutes, but let's look at how you might do this in Lightroom if you don't want to use Photoshop. So in Lightroom, it's a very similar process, but what you'll do is you'll use the crop tool here, and you will want to change right here where it says original. You'll click and you'll see that you can enter custom, and here you can do the same thing, enter 1920 by 980. You don't have to put pixels or anything because it's just going by the aspect ratio here, but then it brings up your overlay in that specific aspect ratio, and you can drag it and crop it exactly like you want, and then you'll be able to export with that crop. Next, let's talk about the perfect width for your blog images. Now the key here is that your images be the size of the content width of your page. And so here you can see in my theme settings, I found that my website content width is 1080 pixels. But if you don't know that, you can also, if you're using Chrome, you can, I'll show you how to get to this. If you just right click and click inspect, and then if you use this little tool right here to select an element and hover over any element, you'll see, if we look right here, that it's showing me the width in pixels. So I can just look at the content width here and see that it's 1080 pixels. And no matter how I resize my screen, this content section will never get larger than 1080 pixels. So there's no reason for these images to be larger than 1080 pixels wide. The only reason that they may need to be larger is if you plan on increasing the content width of your blog in the future and you'd like to be future proof, in which case I still do not recommend going any larger than 1920 pixels wide. But my recommendation would be to stay with the width of your blog. So now that you know how to determine the perfect pixel width and aspect ratio, let's talk about how you can save your files to achieve the optimal file size and image quality. I'm going to show you how to do this in several different tools so that you can decide exactly what works for you. I found that you'll always have to experiment a little to figure out where your standards are with quality, and every style is a little bit different, and so each of these tools may affect different images in different ways, and I want you to be able to know some options so that you can experiment for what works for your images. Okay, so first of all, let's look at Lightroom. In Lightroom, you can just use the export dialog, and down here in File Settings, I recommend using a quality of somewhere around 65. 65 seems to be the sweet spot for almost all of my images. You could really experiment with anything from 50 to 80, but usually 65 gives me the results that I'm looking for. So this is a good starting point in Lightroom. Try 65 and see what you come up with. You can also choose to limit the file size if you have a very specific size in mind. Let's say you want all of your images to be less than 200 kilobytes or something like that. You could click here and type in the number of kilobytes that you want, and it will adjust the quality accordingly. I would be very cautious using something like this because it may sacrifice quality significantly. Right here in image sizing, you can choose to resize to fit and then pick the long edge and do 1080 pixels, or you could do width and height and choose that you want them to be 1080 pixels wide. Now it won't make this a square, it will choose either width or height for this. Don't worry about resolution when you're exporting for the web. You can leave it at 72 or whatever it is. This shouldn't make any difference for images that are going to be going up on the internet. You can also look here in the output sharpening section and choose whether you want to sharpen. Sometimes I will use sharpen for screen whenever I export for my blog. This is a personal preference, and you'll need to experiment with it to see exactly what works for your images. Now, when you do use sharpening, it increases the file size slightly. So turning this off will decrease the file size a little bit and keep the images truer to the original. So play around with this and see what you like. Sometimes this will make a huge difference in your images being sharper at a small size so that they look like you want them to look. At that point, you can just click export, and it will export your files with these settings. Another tip for you is that you can get all your settings just like you like them, and then click add to save a preset and name this whatever you want and create, and then over here it will save your preset for later so that you don't have to go back and adjust these settings every single time. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at Photoshop. Now in Photoshop, what you need to use is the Save for Web dialog, Save for Web and Devices here. But I'm using an older version of Photoshop, by the way, just because I have a lot of plugins and stuff, so it should be very similar in the Save for Web dialog in the newer versions. But the first thing I usually do is adjust the image size, because otherwise the Save for Web dialog is really slow and clunky. So I'll go ahead and change this to 1080 because I know that's the width that I want for my blog here. And this would be the same as earlier whenever we talked about cropping for an aspect ratio. You can go ahead and crop ahead of time and then use Save for Web. Now in the Save for Web dialog, you again have quality, and again 65 seems to be the sweet spot for me, but anything between 50 and 80 could work depending on the images. So again, you'll have to experiment for yourself with this to see what works for your images. We're going to leave this on JPEG, and you can see here the image size is right because we've already set that. And down here you can see that this will be 309 kilobytes whenever we save it. You'll click save and it'll ask you where you want to put it, and you can go ahead and save that file. Next up, let's look at BlogStomp. So in BlogStomp, you can actually import the original size images because it's going to use its own image compression, and we can change the amount of compression here in the settings tab. So if we go to settings and then we go to styles, over here you'll see JPEG quality, and unlike Photoshop and Lightroom, I have found that if you go down to 65, it's going to be, in my experience, the quality is way too low. So I recommend trying somewhere around 85 with BlogStomp and see what you like. For me, 85 has worked very well, so I'm going to leave that there. And you can just use BlogStomp as usual. I just wanted to show you that you can set the JPEG quality here in BlogStomp, and that with my experimenting, it doesn't matter if you export them with a lower quality out of Lightroom or Photoshop. No matter what size you start with, BlogStomp pretty consistently comes up with the same size whenever you export them. And finally, I wanted to show you a piece of software called JPEG Mini. And with JPEG Mini, you can take images and drag them here, and it will go ahead and optimize the file size of those images. Now, sometimes you will not be able to see a difference whatsoever, and other times you'll be able to see a noticeable difference. It kind of depends on how much you've already optimized your images. So JPEG Mini is really great for saving space on your hard drive. If you're exporting full-size images and you drag those into JPEG Mini, you won't be able to see much of a difference, if any, and you'll save about half the file size in most cases. But whenever you've already saved and you've already optimized the file size and you're down to like quality 75 or 65, and then you go into JPEG Mini, sometimes you will notice some artifacting and banding and things like that. So I'm telling you about JPEG Mini because in some cases I have found that I can use it even after compressing with Photoshop or Lightroom or BlogStomp and not notice much of a difference, and other times I do notice a difference. So this is up to you whether you want to use something like JPEG Mini. So here you can see some of the results of my experimenting with this image. The original file size at 100 quality, the size is 14.9 megabytes. Now that is at the full 5760 by 3840. It's about 15 megabyte image. Now when I took that image, put it through JPEG Mini, it got down to 7.7 megabytes, and you couldn't notice any difference. Now with the Photoshop Save for Web at 65 quality, I got down to, and 1080 pixels now, by the way, I got down to 238 kilobytes. Whenever I ran that through JPEG Mini, got that down to 193 kilobytes. With let's look at a Lightroom export 65 quality, no sharpening, 264 kilobytes. With sharpening, 286 kilobytes. And then running those through JPEG Mini reduced the file size by a little each time. I won't pull those up on this video because after all of the compression of the video, the quality representation probably won't be very accurate, but you can do this kind of experimenting for yourself, and you can see here that I just tried each one and named it accordingly. And then I also did a BlogStomp folder here where I stomped at different qualities to see what was the best result, and I found 85 to be the best. When I went down to 75, I noticed too many artifacts, and I was actually starting to see the quality decrease. With 85, there's barely any difference. So hopefully this has helped, and you can start to experiment with all of these tools and figure out the perfect process for you to optimize your image file size so that you can have great quality images on your website without taking a really long time to load.